Welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World, and today we're going to try to save Cuba. We have seen what has been happening there in terms of the protest and the freedom seekers and the authoritarian government who has shot and killed at least one protester. At least 100 have been detained. Lord only knows what is happening to them. Cuban Americans in South Florida are imploring the U.S. government to do something, say something, anything more forceful, more helpful, to let the Cuban government know that Americans are on their side as they seek liberty in their country. And there are people in South Florida who say that their family members, they have never seen anything like this. They have never seen a push for freedom quite like this, that it feels very, very different. But will this be enough to jostle the country loose from the authoritarian reach of the communist government? Joining me now, Dr. Jorge Duany. He is from Florida International University, where he serves as director of the Cuban Research Institute. He's also a professor of anthropology. Welcome to Kennedy Saves the World.
Thank you for having me.
So what is this push for freedom, and how is it different from other protests and uprisings we've seen in Cuba in the past?
Well, I think that your description caught the main point well, which is that this is the first time, I would argue, since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, that such a large number of people have taken to the streets to express their dissatisfaction with the existing conditions, and that ranges from the handling of the pandemic all the way up to the situation of human rights in Cuba. So it's a very widespread feeling of frustration and desperation, and it's specifically focused on the existing Cuban government and its President Miguel DiazCanel.
Has he lost his grip on power? What is it now that gives people confidence to go into the streets? Because before, anytime there was an uprising like this, Cuba's had no problem jailing dissidents, like any sort of political dissidents. They will throw them in jail. And, they brag about having a very high literacy rate, but people in Cuba are not allowed to read about the natural oppression that follows from communism. So has President DiazCanel, has he lost his grip somehow? What's going on internally that is giving these protesters confidence?
It's difficult to know, again, because first of all, the government cut down on internet access, and the reports that we were getting on Sunday that were, as things were taking place, are no longer coming as quickly. So communication has been cut deliberately by the Cuban government, because much of the protests were organized through social media like Facebook and Instagram and so on. So we're slowly getting reports of things on the ground as they're happening, and there appear to still be violent confrontations between state and police forces and some of the protesters who are still in the streets. With regard to Miguel DiazCanel, who is a relatively recent president. In the last couple of years, he succeeded Raúl Castro in power, and eventually also got the highest vote in the Cuban Communist Party. So he's supposed to be in charge. But frankly, because this is the first major crisis that he faces in Cuba, I think he hasn't been tested. And from what I saw on Sunday, particularly when he improvised a press conference reacting to the first protest, he actually called to almost what sounded like a civil war for revolutionaries to go out into the streets and defend the revolution over the dead bodies. That was his language. And at that point, I think that was not the best rhetoric to use. It was quite inflammatory. The next day, on Monday, he actually tried to step back a little bit and clarify what he meant by that. But I think in many ways, the polarization between those who support the revolution, those who are against it, or at least unhappy with it, has grown, and it doesn't bode well for a peaceful revolution of those opposite viewpoints.
All right, so what could the possible outcomes be here? What could the possible outcomes be for, if his regime is toppled? What replaces it, and what does Cuba look like?
Yeah, I don't expect that there will be an immediate regime change because of protests. I mean, there clearly has been a major shock to the stability of the regime, which, as you mentioned at the beginning, was sort of a done deal that for decades, the Cuban government had been able to crush any opposition movement by arresting them, harassing them, or expelling them. I mean, migration to the United States has always been an escape valve for people who don't sympathize with the government. But this time around, it seems to be a different kind of moment because of the large number of people who were out in the streets. The fact that this was a nationwide phenomenon with more than 50, perhaps 60 individual protests throughout the island, all the way from the west in Havana to the east in Santiago de Cuba and everything in between. So it does seem like a major challenge to the status quo, but because of the entrenched nature of the military in Cuba, the security forces, the Cuban Communist Party, and the current leadership, it seems almost utopian, I think, at this point to expect a major change in the power structure. However, it's still very surprising to see the kind of explicit political opposition being articulated quite publicly, probably for the first time since the 1990s, when there was a smaller disturbance called El Maliconazo.
This is Kennedy Saves the World. Don't go anywhere. And what is the likelihood that the military would disconnect from President Diaz-Canel and, somehow land on the side of the protesters and freedom? Is that likely at all? Because as we know, whoever has the guns has the power. The military has the guns, and there would have to be a coup in order for that shift to occur. So what is that likelihood? What is the political climate like in Cuba, and how attached is the military to the communist government?
I wish I could say that it's very likely that a group of reformist officers might decide to join together and change the structure of the government. But unfortunately, everything I know about the Cuban political system and the military tells me otherwise. In fact, over the past decade or so, there has been a wholesale restructuring of the Cuban military, particularly in the upper levels. When Raúl Castro was in power, he systematically changed the old guard and put people in power who are now the leaders of the military as well as the government, who were loyal to him personally and to the revolution. So at this point, it doesn't look like there's much space to expect a large sort of democratic reformist movement from within, although there are, of course, differences among even members of the ruling party and the military as to what kind of strategy would be better to face the very deep economic and political crisis that Cuba is facing right now.
And they're facing food shortages of medicine. They don't have a lot of coronavirus vaccines. And, that may not be driving it, but it certainly is a symptom of the discontent. And also, if Cuban teenagers are like any other teenagers in the Western Hemisphere and in the world, they're looking at social media. They are longing to have a life that is Instagram ready. Something they want to experience things the way that every other normal teenager does, and they really can't. And it's that longing for freedom and assimilation and aspiration that is driving that. So is it the kind of thing like the younger generation can help dictate to the government, like, if you're not going to change completely, then at least do this for us. At least let us have elections. At least let us have, some choice when we go to the grocery store. At least open up the markets a little bit so we can get a taste of something that makes life here a little bit more, if not ideal, then pleasant.
Yes, I agree. And you've just mentioned several factors that I think help to explain what triggered the current situation. And certainly the most immediate spark was the situation with the pandemic. Cuba is now facing the worst moment in terms of its treatment of coronavirus patients, the number of deaths.
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.